How is AI integrated into your work and in your life right now?
I'm a host of a podcast where I try to ask good questions. My upcoming guest is a geneticist, and I just upload the EPUB of the file. Then I'll just have a bunch of chats where I'm like, well, how does he explain what groups made up modern Europeans? It has all the context in there. That ends up being incredibly useful. The first thing I do is just, what are the key ideas and concepts I really need to understand? It's given me a bunch of question answer pairs that consolidate the key things I need to understand about this post. So a lot of topics I just find I have a vague sense of what's happening, but I don't really get it. And it's super helpful to chat with Claude to make sure I'm on the right track. Wait, step back. Why is this necessary? What's going on? How do I think about the broader context of what's happening here? Because I really can't ask good questions unless I have a good mental model of what they're talking about, where all this fits together. I have come up with a couple of different workflows and tools that help me really interrogate and make sure I've reinforced what I'm reading about or learning. And the language model is very helpful because it gives you the content in another context. It can quiz you if you want. I really just want to know everything.
It seems like every company these days is rolling out an AI chatbot in the bottom right corner of their website, but they're mostly still pretty annoying to use. But what if a chatbot could act less like a chatbot and more like a conscientious human being? It could know what you've done, look up account information, and even perform actions on your behalf. It could take over your mouse and guide you through the site in real time. That agent exists, and it's called Command Bar, and they're a sponsor of this show. Command Bar's user assistance platform is an intelligent agent that companies can embed on their website. It looks like a regular chatbot, but it isn't one. It can perform actions on the user's behalf. It can fetch data. It can even co-browse with them through the website. And it's not just reactive. It can actually be proactive. It can nudge users when they seem confused and help them through the site. It's sort of like a friendly human assistant standing by and helping a user when they need it, not just an annoying barrage of pop-ups. It's a power-up for product and support teams that want to drive engagement and activation, encourage conversion, and of course, deflect low-value tickets. And it's trusted by teams like Gusto, HashiCorp, Freshworks, and more. If you're interested in integrating Command Bar into your website, check out the link below or in the show notes. And now, on to the show. Dwarkesh, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
I'm so excited to have you. For people who don't know you, I assume everyone knows you, but for people who don't, you do the best, most, honestly, the smartest interviews in AI that I've found. You have really incredible guests like Mark Zuckerberg, Demis Hassabis, Patrick Collison. You've created the go-to show for smart people to learn about AI, but you also kind of branch out into lots of other things like geopolitics and history and stuff like that. It's really great, and you're just one of the people that inspire me to make smart content. So I appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, that's very kind of you to say. I mean, I've always been sort of trying to have the conversations that I would like to have if I was getting dinner with one of these professors or CEOs. What would I want to ask them? And I'm glad other people enjoy them as well.
Yeah, it comes through. And I think it's really fun to get to turn the tables on you a little bit because you've done some interviews, but mostly you're interviewing other people. And I think it's probably on people's minds how you use AI in your work and in your life. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So maybe just start by giving us a little bit of an overview. How is AI integrated into your work and in your life right now?
Yeah, so it's actually changed a lot. I remember a year ago, this was I think it was after GPT-4. Somebody asked me, do you use AI to help you with your research or prep? And I was like, not at all. It's completely useless in mid. It gives you these banal, you ask it what should I ask? So it's a professor and it'll give you these banal, where did you grow up? What's your book about? Whatever. So initially it was terrible. I think recently the models have gotten to just the point where with these 4.0 or especially with the new Claude models, they're intelligent and interrogative and can consider the context which you provide to them. And so they're still not that good at what should I ask this person? Because obviously that's why I have a job, right? Yeah. So that I can come up with the questions. But for the research itself, for me at least, I try to ingest everything they've ever written, all the rebuttals to their ideas, all the other considerations. And there's often a lot involved, especially given there's many different fields I try to go deep into. The last interview I just did was with Dylan Patel, who writes Semi-Analysis. It's a it's a publication about semiconductors and AI hardware and so on. So like, there's a bunch you have to learn, and I mean, I can go through my workflow, but it's incredibly useful to be able to like have this thing where I'm like, what's going on here? Can you help me explain this? And then I guess one bigger thing I've been thinking about is ever since I interviewed Andy Matuszak, if your audience is familiar, he's the guy who talks a lot about how spaced repetition and other tools can enhance our ability to learn, and how the normal mode of learning, you're actually not picking up that much. If you pick up a random book and start reading, you're not getting that much out of it. And I really have found that to very much to be the case, to the extent that if I'm just like casually reading a book, I think I'm basically wasting time or entertaining myself. And I have come up with a couple of different workflows and tools that help me really interrogate and make sure I've reinforced what I'm reading about or learning. And a tool like a language model is very helpful because like it gives you the context and the content in another context, and you can like it can quiz you if you want. So it's super helpful, that kind of stuff.
That's really cool. I think we should start. I want to start back to front, like with the stuff you're using to read, because I think all that reading is sort of the input, like one of the inputs to the interviews, and then we'll get into the interviews. And I'm really excited for both. So let's start with using AI to read and to learn.
So as I was talking about, like one of the main things I think is important is if I'm studying a topic over the course of a few weeks, it's especially if it's a difficult topic, it's like new to me. It's incredibly important that I'm not just casually reading, because if you're just casually reading, it's like every day you reread the same key terms, the same concepts, and you start over from scratch. So one of the things I like to do, for example, I was recently interviewing Dylan, right? So if I go to his publication, semi-analysis, there's just a ton of lingo and things you have to understand. So the new one was pretty interesting. It's talking about why nobody has built a huge training cluster yet. And then first thing I do is just like, what are the key ideas and concepts I really need to understand? So I made myself a Hugging Face space. You honestly don't need to do anything like this. You can it's pretty simple to have Claude build you Hugging Face space, or if you prefer, what it literally does is like apply this prompt to everything I paste in. So you just copy paste that prompt into Claude yourself. But basically it just has, I copy pasted some of the things in Andy Matuszak's post about how to write good prompts, and I just asked Claude to make those prompts for me, spaced repetition prompts. So when I do this, hopefully in a few seconds we'll get something back. Initially, this will give me some ideas of like, what are the key ideas here I need to understand? So super useful, right? I can even zoom in a little bit so it's more helpful. So for the audience who's listening, like it's given me a bunch of question answer pairs that consolidate the key things I need to understand about this post about, we can go through the specifics here. I'm sure that the actual specifics of AI hardware will bore people, but a lot of the things where it's like, okay, if you don't get this, you've like totally missed the boat here. And so you can start with something like this. I add it to my spaced repetition app. Or I can just look through this and I'm getting a sense of like, oh, okay, here's what it would take to train a GPT-4 level model on a 100,000 H100 cluster. What are the three main types of parallelism you need to use to train on a big cluster or whatever? And this is on for a technical post. On other kinds of posts, there might be different kinds of cards that come up. For history, it might be a different kind of thing. For philosophy, it might be a different kind of thing. So this gives me a lay of the land.
I love this. This is super interesting. I feel like I can go in like a bunch of different directions, but where I want to start is like, how are you reading and when are you reading? So is this like, are you using this specifically for reading that you're doing for the show, or are you just doing this for any reading that you're doing that you feel like is serious and you really want to learn?
Both. So just this weekend, I was reading, I forgot the author's name, but it's a book called Medieval Technology and Social Change. And it's about how different things that were developed through the last 1,000 to 500 years, technologies like the stirrups, how they affected society. And it's like, it's entertaining, you can read it. And then one of the things is like, okay, did I really understand what's going on here with the relationship he's trying to elucidate? So afterwards, in fact, I have some Claude chats where I was just going through while I was reading it. Let's see if this recollects.
Do it. I want to know. I'm on the edge of my seat because I have this book. It's like sitting on the desk in front of me. And so I want to know what you got out of it.
Okay. So first I just asked it to make spaced repetition prompts for me. First of all, I was just like, I read the chapter. I'm not sure I got it. So just explain to me the chapter about how he says that stirrups created feudalism. Like, what exactly was the connection here? So it's a much more condensed, like, here's what's going on here. Basically, if you understand this, it's a useful scaffold so that when you're reading the rest of the chapter, you understand where the pieces fit together.
Have you tried, like, one of the things that I've tried with this is, like, because sometimes it doesn't know, especially for a book like that where it's like not that popular. Have you tried, like, one of the things I do is create a little Claude project and then upload the text if I can find it. Have you tried that?
In fact, let me just Claude.ai projects. So if I go to, I literally just I'm like, I'm a host of a podcast where I try to ask good questions. My upcoming guest is a geneticist, and I just upload I get the EPUB of the file. I convert the EPUB to a text using an online converter. I upload it to Project Knowledge. Then I've only just started prepping for this guest, but I'll just have a bunch of chats where I'm like, how does he explain what groups made up modern Europeans? It has all the context in there. That ends up being incredibly useful, like you were saying.
Yeah, that's so cool. I love that. I love that feature. Okay, wait, let's go back to stirrups and in this chat you're having with this book, or about the book.
Yeah. So, it explains that the reason stirrups created feudalism is because you needed a lot of land basically to support the kinds of people who become heavy cavalry, the knights. The knights need a lot of land in order to have the income to have, armor and lances and other kinds of equipment, and to train themselves. But a knight is only possible if you have a stirrup against which you can brace yourself as you're attacking with a sword, because otherwise you're just like a Mongol who's shooting bows and arrows. So, but then there's a bunch of stuff that's confusing here, like, why is it that expensive to be a knight, that you need to, like, completely confiscate church lands in order to subsidize this knight lifestyle? And then on these kinds of questions, the author is dead, but it's just like, I'm just like murky about it. I don't know what's going on. So I can just, these kinds of things the book didn't even talk about, right? But I can always just continue the conversation with Claude and have it explain what's going on. And so this is just like a recreational reading that Claude ends up being super helpful with.
I think that's really interesting. What do you think about like books like this? Like, in your, as a person who likes history a lot, books that sort of single out like a specific thing, like the stirrup, and then are like, well, you can trace all this stuff to that like one thing, where it like makes so much sense. But then there are things like, I don't know, like Guns, Germs, and Steel, where like Jared Diamond had that whole thesis about, I can't remember the exact thing, but it's like people in warmer climates, or I can't remember the exact thesis, but it turned out to be like totally wrong. Yeah. How do you feel about things like that?
Yeah. So my opinion on these kinds of books, there's one, I mean, the sort of concise answer is like, yeah, there's ones that do it poorly, but just don't read the ones that do it poorly or something. There is a failure mode for public intellectuals where they initially start off with a discipline and they do some exemplary work there. And then they write an initial broad book that's about how this idea explains a lot of the world, and it does incredibly well. And now they're in like public intellectual mode. And now that the next book has to be like, here's my theory of everything. And it's just not that satisfying. So I do worry about those kinds of things. But presumably the reason, I don't know, I'm not into like reading 500-page books about like, just how the stirrup physically worked. Like, what's the point of that, right? I do want to understand the implications, and maybe they're wrong, but I mean, what else are we trying to do here, right? Do we just care about, maybe you just intrinsically care about how the stirrup physically works? I will point out a couple of examples. So there's a lot of interesting topics where you really can't get at the heart of the matter without just considering the whole story. And in fact, so a couple of biographies especially stand out in this way, where if you look at Caro's biography of LBJ or Kotkin's biography of Stalin, it's basically a history of this 20th century, or in the case of Kotkin, even before the 20th century. I think the Caro books on LBJ start off with the Comanche raids on frontier settlers in the mid-19th century or something. And it goes through rural life in Texas, why electrification was such a big deal, a whole bunch of other things, right? Now, so it's basically a history of the 20th century, but it has a very specific point of view or a specific a locus, a character that's moving the story along. And I find those to be incredibly helpful in getting a full picture of what's going on in an era. There's a couple other books where they really aren't trying to write a theory of everything. Like, I don't think Caro's trying to write about like what is the history of the 20th century, but they just can't help themselves. They feel like you really cannot understand the very specific topic I care about unless I tell you everything about everything. Kotkin's story, biography of Stalin, starts with Bismarck's career as a military general and how that changed the way that different powers thought about colonialism and the need to modernize. And that's where it starts, right? And it's a biography of Stalin. So I love those kinds of books.
I think there's like a very just deep point about the universe being interconnected there, but there's also like a really interesting point for people who want to make stuff, like make writing or make podcasts or whatever, because like there's this deep fear that everyone has about like being pigeonholed, and it's like, well, if I pick this like really specific topic, I won't be able to like bring all of myself to it, or I won't be able to be like multifaceted. And it's like, no. If you just pick one guy, Lyndon Johnson, and really get deep into him, you have to explain everything else about the world in order to explain him. And I love that. And like, as a creator myself, like that's the thing that I think about when I'm like, oh, maybe I'm getting too narrow here. It's like, no, the narrow is actually good. You can find the entire universe in the narrow.
Yes. Yeah. I couldn't have said it better.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, what I'm seeing right now is you're using Claude when you're reading books that you care about like learning from, and you're using it a little bit to like prepare your mind for like what you're about to read, which I think is particularly good for like difficult books, or for like thinking through a particular argument before you like go through it. You're asking questions. So you're kind of like, it's a reading companion. You're getting more out of the books you read from that, but then you kind of take what you've read and throw it into this card generator.
Yeah, and so that's mostly it's just chatting with Claude. And so let me see if I can find a better example. So I mean, a lot of topics I just find I've have a vague sense of what's happening, but I don't really like get it. And it's super helpful to chat with Claude to make sure I'm on the right track. One was like, Dylan has a couple of posts about why packing as a technology is super necessary for these advanced chips. I'm not trying to make this podcast all about AI hardware. It just happens to be the last podcast I did, so that's what you're getting. But then it's like it's like a 5-series post about how advanced packing works and how, what the technical specifications are. And I'm like, wait, step back. Why is this necessary? What's going on? All kinds of other questions about when there's questions about how, I'm worried about where I might get too deep in the weeds when I'm just explaining. Yeah, basically, I'm just like, how do I think about the broader context of what's happening here? Because I really can't ask good questions unless I have a good mental model of what they're talking about. Like, I really get where all this fits together.
That makes sense. And so and so Claude is kind of like the first thing you flip to when you want to know that. Are you using it on mobile or using it on desktop?
Desktop.
Okay. Interesting. So you're doing most of your like reading and research stuff on desktop.
Yeah, that's right.
And what do you think about like just Claude being really great right now, and like I assume your ChatGPT usage is lower than it used to be.
Yeah, I think these things will keep getting better over time, and I think we're just like getting in the practice of using these tools. I'll talk a little bit about how these tools relate to my post-production process. Initially, it was kind of useless, but I did spend a few weekends trying to write a few prompts and create a workflow. At the time, it was basically useless. Now it's actually ended up being useful, and I can use the same, Jupyter notebooks or whatever to get things done. So it is worth investing in getting, even if they don't work perfectly now, to get them part of your workflow so that as they keep getting better, you're getting the returns from that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I want to just go back to the Anki card generator, the space repetition card generator. So as part of this, once you've done all the sort of like conceptual, clearing the ground conceptually for yourself to like kind of understand the basics of what a guest is talking about or an idea that you're interested in, then you're kind of you're adding to your flashcards so that I guess so that you retain the information past even when you talk to that guest. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think of the larger mission of the podcast is to why does the podcast get better over time? And it's because basically I'm getting smarter or learning more things. I'm reducing my ignorance around a bunch of topics. And so if I don't do that, I mean, I think about all the episodes I did before I interviewed Andy and started using spaced repetition. And I just like really regret it because I talked to all these world experts in a ton of different domains. And to be honest, like in many cases, I didn't take that much away. I vaguely remember some things. And now that I can walk you through the kinds of cards I make and the spaced repetition tools I use. But it's like totally a game changer in terms of what I can retain. And in fact, I think it's not even about making sure I remember what I discussed in a previous episode or what I learned previously. It's more about future learning, because I'm sure you've heard the saying about learning compounds, because you can use what you've learned in the past to learn future things because they all interconnect. Well, you can't do that if you've basically forgotten most things you've learned in the past. So my learning of future other things has become much faster because I have cached all these different concepts and figures and facts. So future things are just like, I understand how everything fits together much more. It's not even about the past. It's really about future learning.
Mm. Can we see your, I don't know what you use for spaced repetitions. Can we see your deck?
Yep. I will point out, by the way, as a side note, one use case of Claude that ended up actually being pretty useful. Sometimes you read obscure philosophy. Like I was reading Nick Land's selected writings about AI and his accelerationism, and I was like, "What's going on?" I'm like, "What is his argument? Basically, like, why does he think that the AI takeover and the whatever thing it creates in the aftermath will be goo?" Because he's a smart guy. I'm assuming he has an interesting argument. So I upload the PDF of his selected writings. I just asked Claude, like, okay, so why does he think it's a good thing that AIs take over humans? And it offers a summary. Like, initially, this isn't necessarily that helpful because I kind of did read this in the essay. But what's helpful is that when you go through and I'm like, I respond like, I don't get it. Like, what does he think is wrong with human society that you can't, you have to erase it? And then he gives an explanation. And I'm like, I still don't get it. Like, what exactly are you talking about here? And then like, here's what I do with the podcast, right? I have the guest on and I ask them, what do you mean here? Like, I disagree. Here's a contradiction, whatever. And going through their writings with Claude and like, have I actually found a sort of blind spot in their thinking, or is this just me being confused about their ideas? It's super helpful.
That is really interesting. It's like you can get down to a deeper level before you talk to them, so that you can start there with them as opposed to like starting at the surface.
Exactly.
Which is really cool. I use that too for like for difficult books, like not necessarily for like interviewing the author of those books, but like, for example, I interviewed Reid Hoffman like, I don't know, a month or two ago, and I wanted to talk to him about the kind of like intersection between philosophy and AI. And he was like, he almost became a philosophy professor like at Oxford, wanted to, like, was really deep into Wittgenstein. So like I read a bunch of Wittgenstein, which I hadn't read in a while. And I just used Claude for it, and it was like so much better because I haven't taken a Wittgenstein class, or maybe I took one in college like a long time ago, but I've read him a lot, and it just, there are always those points in those kinds of books where you're like, I think I know what they're saying, but like I'd probably have to go to a graduate school and like get a master's in this to like really know. And Claude is actually like, makes me be like, oh, I don't need that anymore. Like I any book I want to read like this, like I basically know. And it just helped me so much in that interview, because I could just read like really deep Wittgenstein related questions and he could answer them.
Yep. I think that's totally legitimate. I think some people would be like, oh, you need to read it in the original, blah, blah, blah. I think if you care about the ideas and you think the ideas are timeless and the ideas are not about the specific kind of prose that the original author used, but just generally like, what is the essence and the gist of what's happening here? If you care about the ideas, then I think this is totally valid, right? I don't disagree with the people who are like, no, you need to read like the specific syllables that Wittgenstein used.
Yeah. I mean, I'm also just saying like, I have the book open and then I just take one of his like statements and just throw it in there. And then it's like, here's what it means or whatever, which I think is really great. Okay. So you're going to show us the spaced repetition card. So what app is this?
This is Mochi.
Interesting.
It's like Anki, but this is the one I use.
Why?
So that actually I don't have any cards today because I just went through them this morning. But let me give you a sense of what kinds of things I have. Right. So
Yeah.
I have, if you go through history, recently I've been planning on interviewing David Reich, who is a geneticist who explores human origins. And these are especially cases where just like reading the book, I'm like, I would have totally forgotten. He names all these different ancestral groups and how they combined and in what eras. You know, when did the Yamana people come through Europe? When did the Anatolian hunter-gatherers, wash over Eurasia? All these things I was just like, you read it in one year, it goes out the other one, unless you make cards for it. And so I made a ton of cards about this kind of stuff. And so there's examples of that here. It's especially useful for hardware and technical things. So here, I feel like if I don't make cards, I'm just constantly relearning the same things because I didn't learn the lingo in the right way first. It's not just about learning the terminology. It's about understanding the underlying concepts. Let me give you a good example of that. So maybe I'll step back and I'll explain, like, I go through these cards in the morning. Maybe you can see what it kind of looks like if I do the cram cards thing.
Please.
I can go through them, and right now I'm like, I remember this, right? I remember it's, this is the first one that came up randomly, but it's multi-query attention to not have to use huge KV values, and then sharing KV values between layers and using local attention. And that's the answer. Now, it seems sort of trivial right now because it's just like three things, but like I would have totally forgotten about this if I hadn't made a card for this as soon as I read the blog post. And then it just like I've wasted my time. In the future, if I'm learning about these technologies in a different context, I just like don't have the connection to what was happening here to connect it to, right? If I go to a different category, if I go cram cards, this is the white thing. I would have totally forgotten about it if I hadn't made these cards. I'm just a big fan right now. I've sort of I've become a space repetition fanboy these days.
How do you think about like the usefulness of space repetition in a world where like any of these questions is like pretty much answerable, like with Claude, with like a one search?
Yes. So I think it's about not necessarily remembering this information, but when a future thing comes in, you understand like the conceptual. In fact, let me give you a good example of this, right? So I remember sometimes I actually make cards about facts that I don't even understand in the moment, but in the future, as I learn more about the field, as the sort of territory becomes more clear, the things I said in the card make more sense to me. So if I was reading some of Colin Burns' papers, and so I made this card about like why Colin Burns thinks that alignment is a tractable problem, or understanding what the model thinks is a tractable problem. And at the time, I wrote things down about like, features are in a linear space. What does that mean? Or like we can sort of see features in other sorts of categories. And at the time, I'm like, I have no idea what this means, so I'm just going to write it down because I read the blog post, and there was no point of reading the blog post if I'm not going to make the card. Later on, as I learned more about how the residual stream model of how attention works, what that is and so forth, this card made much more sense to me in the future. But I would have just like totally memory hold, or not even memory hold, I would have totally forgotten this content, which required future understanding if I hadn't made a card of it. And then when I see the card again in the future, I'm like, oh, this is what Colin Burns meant. Now that I understand how attention works, this is what it means, right?
Yeah. This is really interesting to me. So I want to get into some of the ways that you use AI for interview prep, because I think we've mostly covered the reading stuff. But before we do that, I just want to like understand like what is driving all of this. Like it feels like you are just consuming massive amounts of information and turning that into knowledge in your head. Like you have this sort of just overdrive of curiosity, which I actually resonate with a lot. Like I'm surrounded right now by books, and I'm just sort of like curious for you what do you think that's about?
I think I really just want to know everything, right? I don't know how to express it. There's a beautiful passage in a Will Durant book as he's turning 90, where he's writing a memoir basically of his main ideas, called Fallen Leaves. And there's a passage on philosophy where he says, as you get older, maybe with all the philosophy and history I've done, I've reached some plateau of higher understanding and clearer insight, or at least I've understood that such a thing is possible. And something like that just resonates with me. I don't know. I find that idea really appealing. I'm nowhere close to it, but hopefully in the years to come, that'll just be a thing that, I also really admire people I've had on the podcast who do have these self-consistent and really deeply interrogated world models. I've interviewed these guests, and some of them, a couple of names come to mind, people like Carl Schulman or Tyler Cowen or Bern Hobart. It feels like they've really read everything, and, everything is a subset of what they know. And I just, I find them to be super compelling as thinkers. Of course, there's many things they can still be wrong about. I'm not one of these people who buys like, there's like a thing where you just know everything and you can never be wrong, right? You always have blind spots. But their ability to, which you can see when you talk to them, to connect anything you ask them about. And they're like a Claude 6 in the sense of like, you start talking about why has a fraction of finance as a percent of GDP. I remember asking Tyler this, and he has a right off the cuff, just a super interesting answer that connects a bunch of different disciplines. You ask Carl about like how fast AI hardware could grow, and just like done this sort of Fermi estimates on how fast algae bloom and how much solar power they consume, and how many fabs TSMCs make. It just like I find that sort of compression of the input they've ingested over their lives, and they can not only do they know that stuff, but they can really connect it in a really interesting and compelling, novel way. I find it super compelling.
And in terms of developing your own worldview, like, do you have that anywhere where it's like you're creating like some sort of living document, or is it just all in your head, like all the stuff that you're learning? Obviously, you have the cards, but that feels like more like dots in the space rather than like the ways that they all connect and how you think about everything all together as a system.
I think I've been trying to do more of this recently, and now that I've sort of built up an underlying maybe vocabulary or understanding because of the podcast, it makes sense to do more of this. Something I've been doing recently, let me pull this up. I've only just started. Hopefully there'll be more by the time people are looking at this. But I've started writing, riffs on different books or things I read. And if I go to, it's basically on my website. And so just like I can read a book and I have questions, or I connect it with other things I've read. I remember, for example, when I was in Steven Pinker's Language Instinct, he was writing the book before the FOXP2 gene that can help explain human language was found. And so he has all these observations that are then later explained by the FOXP2 gene. And so I can just sort of, the sort of connection that you're talking about, I can do by riffing on other people's ideas. I actually am curious, do you have suggestions on what I should be doing? Maybe I should be writing more blog posts, or what do you suggest I should do?
Well, that's a good question. So, before we get there, like one of the things that this reminds me of, I think Claude is so good for reading old science books because it can tell you what's outdated and what's not. I do that all the time, and I love that. I love that little thing. But yeah, I mean, I think basically like developing a worldview is like, you have to just try, and you try over and over and over again. And I do think like blog posts are really good for that, especially like, for me, like I have to write every week. And so I'm like forced to take a view on something. And generally, if you're like intellectually honest, you like want one post to like somewhat like agree with the last post, and your audience will call you out if you're like just disagreeing with yourself all the time. So you're kind of developing a worldview that way. But for me, like right now, I'm actually like, my big thing this quarter is like, I just have these like ideas that are simmering that are like sort of the relationship between like language models and like some deep philosophical questions that we've been like talking about since like Plato, which is like the appearance reality distinction, and like how do we know what's true and what's knowledge and all that kind of stuff. Like I think there's a lot of overlap there, and it requires like, it's going to be like a 10,000 word post or something like that. And so what I'm doing is I just have like a Claude project with like, I have all these like little notes and riffs and like, and stuff. And I'm just like going into Claude and being like, hey, like, what's the thread here? Like, what's going on? Can you help me like figure out like, there's something in me that I have all these little ideas for, but I can't quite like put it into an argument that all makes sense. And I think just honestly, like sitting with that for like a couple months, I will know what's in there, but there's something in there. And yeah, it's cool.
Do you make a Claude project to like, here's some of the things I'm thinking, how do they connect? Or like, how do you keep track of those things over those months?
Exactly. I'll just show it to you. Let me just pull it up. So, okay. So if I go into Claude, I have a couple different projects. One project is Seeing Like a Language Model, which is the title of this big post, whatever it is. Another is Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. So this is like a book that I'm reading as prep for this this piece that I'm writing. I've read it a bunch of times before, but like now I'm like doing a little bit of a deeper read, and so I have like the whole book uploaded, and then I can like ask questions. Then I have another one that I love called My Psychology, which has a bunch of like journal entries, goals I've set for myself over the years, and then also like things I've observed about my psychology, or things I'm working on, like little aspects of myself that I'd like to grow or change. And so when I'm making decisions or thinking something through, I just go in there and it can reference all that stuff, so it knows who I am, which is really cool. So in Seeing Like a Language Model, let me see if I can pull it up in the projects directory. So I have like, basically I have this one note in Apple Notes, which is like, every time I have a little thing come into my head, I'm like, I just put it in there. Like, let me see if I can find it for you. I just throw it in here, and this is like huge and messy, and it's like different quotes from different books and like just different ideas that like come to me off the top of my head as I'm like walking around. And I think that there's like a thread here in all of this stuff. They're all like, I can see how they're all related, but like I can't quite pull it out. And so like what I've been doing is I just like throw it all in here. We have this like all the quotes and all the ideas and fragments. I have a little bit of a draft, like an intro, and then I have a chapter of a book by Richard Rorty that I think is really good, called Pragmatism as Anti-Authoritarianism, that like kind of sparked this whole thing. Like I read a chapter of that book, and then I was like suddenly like rereading like a bunch of Plato and like Aristotle, and like I was just down this huge rabbit hole. And so like what I did, for example, is I put all that stuff in here, and I was like, hey, I have a bunch of notes and some fragments of text for a long 10,000-ish word piece I want to write called Seeing Like a Language Model, but I need to understand what I actually think and make a bit of an outline before I get started. In order to do that, I need to understand the patterns of what I've been thinking and writing down and reading about. Can you suggest some ways that you can help me do this? I want to get from where I am to an outline. You have access to some fragments, notes, and early unfinished intro. And it just like has a bunch of ideas like thematic analysis or argument mapping or chronological development. And I'm just like sort of going down the rabbit hole with it, where it's like, I asked it to do concept clustering. So it's like, one of the concepts that I'm playing with is the philosophical divide, Plato versus Aristotle, which I think is like not quite right. It's actually Plato versus the sophists, but like it's close. Or the evolution of Western thought. It's like, how does Plato like how does Plato ladder up into the rest of Western thought and into science and just the way the Western mind works? And then how do language models sort of like differ from that paradigm? So that's the basic thing that I'm trying for, because I do have, the reason I ask this question is because I'm selfishly like, I feel like a little bit I haven't done the like big idea thing as much as I really want to, because I am writing every week. I am sort of like reacting to stuff, and so I want to be a little bit more thoughtful. And this is my like attempt to put all of it together into something that like makes sense.
Yeah, as you're going through this really actually makes me want to write more, because now that you're talking about it, now that you ask the question, I'm like, yeah, I should be sort of consolidating the things I'm learning in a more comprehensive way, and in a way that's also more useful and accessible to other people as well, right? I spend weeks like learning about some not random, but like the things I care about. I'm about to prepare for Daniel Jorgen, the guy who wrote The Prize. It's a history of oil, or a geneticist, AI researcher or whatever, to the extent that I'm getting something out of these research processes, I should consolidate it in a way that's not evident in the podcast itself.
Yeah, I mean, I selfishly want you to do that because I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You'll send these out through your newsletter, right? Is that the main way?
I will.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, this will go through the newsletter. I might do something special for it, like maybe we'll make a little mini site for it when it launches. But that's sort of in the future. I have to actually write it first. So let's. I want to move on. I want to talk about the how you use AI to sort of like do the interview prep. So let's move into that, and then we can also maybe even like prep for an interview together.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, let's do it. I honestly, the interview prep is like, it requires a lot of work, but fundamentally what's happening is not that complicated. Like I can just show you a document I might've made in the past. I'll share my screen. So honestly, it literally is just like, I'm going through, I come up with a bunch of questions and I sort of group them together in relevant categories. Or if I go to, if I was interviewing Dylan Patel, sorry, this is not the right one. Just like a bunch of different, it's just like a list of questions, basically. It's not complicated. But the process of coming up with them is, very research intensive. So we can go through, like, if I'm a guest I'm like only barely started preparing for, and we can go through the process of preparing for them.
Yeah, can we? I just want to stop at those questions, like, again, selfishly, because I think it's really interesting. Like, you have these like long lists of questions that are organized by theme. Are you like going down the list, or are you sort of jumping around?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because I come up with these list of questions, but it's like, it really never ends up being, I ask question 1 and I ask question 2 and I ask question 3. I start off with the interesting question, and if you listen to the interviews, hopefully it comes off more as a almost conversation, because I spend so much time preparing that I have these questions basically memorized. And so the next one that is appropriate to their response, if they say something about, memorization in LLMs, I'll have a question prepared about that or related to that, and I'll just ask it next because that's what fits in together. And so I'll have a list, and this is what I'll send them if they ask for it. But like really, it's just sort of me off the cuff. Like here's a question I remember that was relevant to this in the actual interview.
That makes sense. So like the point of the doc is like, it's almost like writing the doc is the prep itself, and it's you don't even necessarily need it in the interview. Like maybe you have it just in case, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And then we can even go through. Let's see. I'm doing a couple of interviews in the future. David Reich and Daniel Yergin. So the former is a geneticist about human origins. The second wrote The Prize, which is the famous book about the history of oil. Which one sounds more interesting to you? We can do that, whichever one.
I want to do the famous geneticists.
So let's go to Claude. In fact, I do have his book uploaded as a project, so we can just use that.
That's great. And so basically what we're going to do is like, we're going to watch you, and I'll do it with you. We're going to prep for an interview with this guy. What's his name again?
David Reich.
David Reich. Okay, cool. Can we get like a little bit of background on David Reich? Like maybe we can even ask Claude, because like obviously I'm a newbie to David Reich's work.
So
I don't know anything about
him. He is a geneticist at Harvard, and over the last decade or so, their research into how have human populations across the world been formed? Basically, like who are the Europeans? What groups make them up? What ancient migrations and genocides and population replacements made them? Same with the Indians or Native Americans or Africans. It's completely changed. They've basically sort of like made many academic disciplines irrelevant because they actually have empirical data on like, here's actually what historically happened. You guys are completely wrong about what you think, your theories of what happened. If you're familiar with Nat Friedman's Yasuvis challenge, like you have these like burnt up squirrels, but with some advanced techniques, you can get some useful information out of them. I feel it's in a similar vein. Obviously, they're not the same kind of project, but like it's a similar vein of like, once we develop the advanced mathematics or genetics or whatever to understand what's latent in the genome, we've just uncovered a ton of insight about what's been going on in human history, basically. And sorry, I'm just getting nerd sniped and just going on riffs here. But like, one of the interesting things is you can see when one population replaces another, whether it was just like, oh, we met and like we were like now intermingling and trading and whatever, or is it like we're committing genocide against you? And you can tell that because if in the case where it's genocide or population replacement, it will be that the male line of the population that is invading will overtake the male line of the existing population, but the female line will remain. So mitochondrial DNA is only comes up in the female line, and you'll see like the female line because they're getting, like the new men who are coming in are taking them as wives or something. And then anyway, so you can just like learn a lot about like what kind of invasion was it? Did they like conquer, or were they just like mingling or something? One of the many things you can see from the DNA.
That's really interesting. Wait, and so this is like basically re-examining DNA evidence of like old settlements and like basically, and he's uncovering new ways of being able to analyze the DNA. Like what's the new methods that they're using to like draw new conclusions from existing evidence?
One of them is just that, right? Like seeing how the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA, because like you can just learn a lot about a population based on how the female versus male line is propagated, about like what was the social structure like and so forth. Another is you can even tell how the level of inequality in a society, because if there's a lot, so for example, in India, one of the things that was super surprising is that the amount of endogamy, which is to say that a certain caste in a certain village would just like not, there wouldn't be any sort of intermixing with another caste in a neighboring village. Like to the extent that's true of nowhere else in the world. And they were able to find this in India, where the amount of social stratification, you can see that in the genetic catalog over the last thousands of years, where for thousands of years, these two neighboring castes haven't mixed. With like 99% or something, which is like even from sort of infidelity or rape or something, you would expect there to be more than what actually ends up being the case. So you can understand modern culture in India based on what has happened over the last few thousand years.
That's really interesting. So I feel like you're doing like such a good job of summarizing his main ideas. But I kind of want you to do the same thing with Claude, so we can see how you stack up versus Claude, because obviously you've input his book into this project, so it has that as reference material. Can we ask it to just like summarize like a few of his main ideas?
That's a great idea. Can you summarize? And maybe like the techniques he used to come up with his
perfect
new insights.
So what you're writing is, can you summarize the main ideas from the book and the techniques used to come up with new insights? Cool. And one thing that's like really cool about this is like, you've been able to do something like this with ChatGPT for a long time, but ChatGPT's context window isn't that long. And so it chops it up. And like, it's not gonna really be able to summarize the entire thing because of that. It has to like find the right parts of the book, and the embedding search in it is not very good and all that kind of stuff. And Claude, you can just like throw a ton of stuff in the context window, and that just like makes a big difference. Okay, so it looks like we've got some answers.
So
here.
it tells us that the ancient DNA has revolutionized our understanding of human prehistory, and then we've learned that populations today are the result of multiple waves of migration and mixture. And then just like a bunch of other genetic stuff. Then it talks about the key techniques about whole genome sequencing and how they've enabled these sorts of new discoveries they've been making. But anyways, just a bunch of interesting things about their research.
Well, now I'm interested in like, okay, so the key techniques that it's using are whole genome sequencing of ancient DNA samples. So is whole genome sequencing like a new thing that you can do it on ancient DNA samples? So it's saying like by improved extraction and sequencing technologies. Is that that's
that is an interesting question. So we can even ask Claude, because I'm not sure how exactly do you sequence an ancient or a prehistoric genome? Like, can you do like what is, how does that work, right? Okay, so they grind the bone, and they have then techniques to get the DNA out of that. Now, another thing we can ask is like, one thing I'm curious about. Let's see. I don't really remember the chapter on Native Americans. I could ask about what exactly happened with Native Americans. Here's one thing I'm curious about. Like, How would, okay, so I don't even know if David Reich addresses this himself, but like, how would David Reich's theories help explain why civilization suddenly emerges so rapidly, and that too concurrently in the new and the old world after 10,000 BC, aka the end of the last ice age? And then I'll just like ask Claude why I think this is an interesting question. So like, this seems like a really remarkable coincidence given how long humans have been around, you know?
That is interesting.
Well, coincidence, given that it'll correct my spelling, given that humans have been around for hundreds of thousands of years.
I didn't realize that we believe that it emerged like at the same time in geographically disparate places. So that's totally new to me. I thought it was like just in Mesopotamia.
Yeah, but it's actually, there's a really good book by Peter Jackson called The Great Divide, and it's one of the most interesting books I read. Just as a side note, it's comparing the emergence of civilization in the New World versus the Old World. So in the Old World, in the New World, the Corral is like a civilization in 3000 BC, and it's based on fishing and not on like conventional agriculture like Mesopotamia. And he talks about how that changed the evolution of the culture in the New World versus the Old World. But anyways,
that's really interesting.
Okay, so major population movements and mixtures, exchange of ideas. So it says maybe there were genetic adaptations during that time. There were no major biological changes. So he's saying that I guess human population, like, we weren't like a different kind of human after the Ice Age. So we're sure common ancestry that were primitively known. Maybe I'll tell it like, be more specific. I still don't. Your answer doesn't help me explain. Your answer doesn't help me understand why the end of the last ice age led to civilization. What changed from before? And then this is really helpful to interrogate LLMs in this way, because their initial instinct, maybe because of RLHF, is to be sort of summarizing mode and comprehensive, and like, I don't know, just like give me the answer, you know?
Totally.
Okay, so maybe climate stabilization, it like increased food sources, population growth. Okay, interesting. Yeah, so this is super interesting. Claude didn't really give me a sort of full answer, but here's why this is still super useful, because now that I know Claude doesn't have a good answer, this makes it all the more interesting for me to ask David Reich. Because otherwise, if it just like given me the right answer, I'm like, oh, okay, this is like a known thing. I'm not going to waste his time with this, right? Now that I know it's like not really clear, now it's going to be such a fun conversation with David Reich.
Yeah, and you sort of know it's not in his book because you've like asked the whole book, which is pretty cool. So here's what I kind of want to do. I want to see if it is good enough at picking up patterns in how you ask questions that it can help you come up with questions that you think are actually pretty good for David Reich. And I don't know if it's going to work. Are you down to try?
Yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do it.
Okay, so basically, who have you interviewed recently-ish that is sort of like in the same vein as David Reich, like the same kind of person?
I think the closest would be Tyler, in the sense of like a more sort of polymathic, less less like AI focused. So if I look up Tyler Cowen questions.
What about like anybody that like specifically deals with like genetics or like sort of population changes? Do you think Tyler, like you covered that in your interview?
Oh, no, not at all. But I just haven't interviewed somebody about that.
Oh, you haven't? Okay, so that's new. So Tyler's good then. I mean, I think Tyler's a good enough broad enough range of ideas that probably work.
Cool. Okay, let me pull up the questions. Okay, so here are the questions I asked Tyler when I have had him on the podcast, and it was like about basically all these different economists. So I read, Keynes's theory of interest, money, and employment. I read Smith. I read like Hayek's all of Hayek's essays, and this was actually a super interesting interview. And I was like asking about the contradictions between Hayek and Keynes. Anyway, so I think this will be a sort of, and Mill obviously. So this will be a super, like, hopefully it'll get what kind of thing I'm trying to do if I add this to Claude. So if we go back to prep, and then I add content, upload from device, or sorry, I guess I just add a text, Tyler Cowen questions. Okay, did that work?
Sweet. So one thing that I want to do first with this is like, can you just ask it, like, given all the questions you asked for Tyler Cowen, like just ask it to pull out the patterns in how you like to ask questions and how you like to conduct interviews.
Cool.
Do that first.
So maybe I'll be like, I'm the host of a podcast. Right. I want you to find the pattern. Maybe I don't want to like prompt it with self-congratulation of a podcast. I want you to find the patterns in my questions. Here's questions from an interview of the economist Tyler Cowen.
One thing I like to add to these is like the results you give me should be so detailed that another AI who is impersonating can follow your output to generate questions like this for a new guest.
That's a great prompt. Yeah. There's patterns you give me to generate questions for a completely different guest.
Nice. Okay. I like that.
Yep. So
you want to read them out?
It says you often ask about comparisons between different kinds of thinkers. You pose what if questions. You ask how historical economic theories might apply to current issues. You present counterarguments and alternative viewpoints to test the strength of theories. You draw connections between economics and other fields. Okay, so maybe I'll just ask it like, I don't always interview economists.
Maybe you should add a couple more
Here are some other examples. Yeah.
Yeah.
Find patterns that are not domain specific. So let's go to Demis. Oh, shoot. Okay, and then we can do Dylan.
Sweet.
It's all right. So it's telling me like, I feel like it's over. It's being like specific to the kinds of interviews I've done because it's asking about like timelines, which I asked Demis about, or technical bottlenecks, resource allocation, industry dynamics. I feel like that's more about what I asked Dylan about with semiconductors. Yeah, I'm not sure how good this was, but we can try it. So,
what if we? What if we said I'm now going to interview a geneticist. He's a geneticist, right? Can you write a guide like for another AI to prepare questions? Basically what I want it to do is like write the guide specifically for interviewing a geneticist based on the patterns in your previous questions. See if it can do that.
Yeah, this is much better. Great prompt. Okay, so it's about adaptability, fundamental concepts, future predictions, comparative analysis. All right, sure. Well, you know what? Let's just try it. So let's put this in. Let's put this in.
Let's try it.
My
Your project.
A lot of different. So we had. Yeah. Okay. So we just go back to
if you just go and click into projects. Yeah.
Help me come up with questions.
Oh yeah, cool.
With questions.
I might actually start a new one and just be like,
and maybe I'll delete this so it's not over biased to that, or you know what, let's keep it. Maybe just maybe learn some context.
Okay. Oh yeah, it'll have examples. That's good. Examples are good.
Questions for David Reich based on these guidelines that another AI generated from other question lists. And then maybe
you can also reference. Yeah, you could tell it to also. I was going to say you could also tell it to reference Tyler Cowen as an example. But
maybe one thing I'll point out that's been sort of a big part of my I've like noticed is that there's a big hesitation, like writing these prompts and reminding the AI, like, here's who I am, here's why I care about this, here's the larger purpose of this project. It just ends up being a sort of big sludge, and that's often what keeps me from using AI tools that I know would increase my productivity, because I'm just like, I don't want to retype. You're an AI and you're trying to help me come up with questions, I'm interviewing blah blah blah, and like write this as you would write to another AI. So hopefully in the future we get models that just like know all this about you, and like you don't even need to remind them, because they would have just been listening to this call and they didn't know what we're trying to do, right? But in the meantime, I just think it's like just like, don't be lazy and just like do the prompting.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the ChatGPT memory feature is like kind of getting there to some degree. I think like Claude Projects, you like it contains custom instructions from one chat to another, so that's kind of nice. But yeah, I agree. I mean, there's a lot of typing to do. But what do you think of the output from this?
Okay, so let's see. So it's asked about. It asks, given the rapid advancements in ancient DNA sequencing, what breakthroughs do you anticipate? How do your methods for analyzing ancient DNA differ from those used in contemporary genetic samples? What are the current? So one thing I'm noticing is that they're very generic questions, and that's kind of what makes it not that useful for me, is like just come up with questions for me, because I try to ask more specific, like it's a more of like, after having read this passage and like considering the research in this area, here are some thoughts I have. Like the 10,000 year BC thing was a perfect example of this, of, okay, we know that civilization emerged rapidly. Like, what was going on there, right? It's a very specific question. And I don't think that if you just, generally, these things just aren't that good at like come up with a specific thing from a large context. It like really wants to, do a summary level or high level kind of questions, right?
I think you're totally right. I think this is like a sort of common failure mode with using AI tools, is like people end up they're like, okay, maybe it can do my entire job for me. And then it's like, no, it's like too high level and it doesn't really work. Cause like ultimately these questions are about what's interesting to you, and it doesn't have enough context on you to like know what you are specifically going to be interested in just from the patterns in previous guests, especially if you don't have guests that, cover the same sorts of topics. Like I think if you had like 5 other interviews with other geneticists, it might do a little bit of a better job. And I think like usually the solve for that is like backing up and thinking about what are the like different micro tasks that I do as part of getting to those questions that this could be helpful for. So like instead of just doing the whole thing all at once, it's like backing up to like the particular context that I'm interested in currently. Like what are the micro tasks that I could replace myself?
For example, the things we're doing with like research is pretty helpful, because like then you can narrow down on like, I want to research X, but not like completing the job where, totally.
Yeah. So you still have a job. We've determined that as far as Claude 3.5 Sonnet goes, not replacing Dwarkesh yet. Before I let you go, I have a couple other questions for you. Really quick. I mean, I have to ask you what your timelines are. If you have any updated timeline.
But by the way, before we do that, should I show? So I've been working on coming. This is like the research, but also in post production. There's a ton of like, we got to find the clips in this interview or whatever, right? So
please, yeah, I forgot about that. Let's go for that. Claude 3.5 Sonnet, good for research, not going to replace you, but you are also using AI not just for reading, not just for research, but also for like helping you sort of in the post-production process of like putting episodes out there. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yep, totally. So obviously there's a bunch of things that go into the post-production of the episode, which I've been trying to come up with workflows to help AI help me out with. Before I started having a human make transcripts of the podcast, and before I had ads to help me subsidize that, what I would do is I would have a text to speech or speech to text assembly AI is the API we use, or I use, have it come up with the transcript, a first draft transcript. And then I have GPT-4 just literally, it says prompt transcript. I came up with a couple methods to do this, and it just says like, so and then I came up with some guidelines so that like, here's some prompts to make sure that when you rewrite the transcript, you're removing filler words, you're making the thing more readable, you're cleaning it up. And it actually worked decently well, but it just wasn't good enough that it beat out a human yet. So, and then it's just like worth it for me to just have a human do it. But other things we're doing is I'm trying to come up with a workflow where I can just upload the MP3 of the episode, and the transcript, it makes an auto-generated transcript. And from that transcript, we can just have it come up and generate different ideas for titles and clips and highlights. And it's a work in progress right now. But, we just do a sort of a few shot learning in the prompt of like, here's what good titles look like. Here's what good clips look like. And this is just a sample 2-minute random interview. But like, I'm trying to like figure out ways to get this kind of workflow going.
That's really great. And the reason I think it's great is because we actually built this too at Every, and we use it all the time. And then we just like released it as an app. Have I shown you Spiral? So if you go to spiral.computer, so basically we just built that into an app where you can create these things called Spiral, where spirals are like basically few shot prompts for repetitive creative tasks that you do. So like for me, when I do this podcast, I always have to come up with a tweet for it. And I put in some few shot examples. It creates a little style guide for itself. And then you get a form that you can share with your team, or just use yourself or share publicly. And then every time you have a new podcast, you just paste it in there. It can pull out tweets. It can do transcripts. It can do like highlights and all that kind of stuff in your style and in your voice using the few shot stuff. It works really well. I use it a ton internally, and it's going kind of viral. Like we're about to pass 3,000 signups for it. It's been like a couple weeks. So I would love, you should, yeah.
Can I set custom prompts? Like I want to generate a tweet using these guidelines or something like that?
Yes, you can.
Okay. I would love to use this.
Okay, cool. You should use it. Like I'll hook you up with an account after this.
In fact, if we were to edit out this stuff, I was thinking about my janky workflow, because it's like I'm trying to describe to Steve Jobs. Like, I have this like little device, and I'm trying to like, I can open up different, I can open up my cell phone.
Oh, I love it. Anyway, we'll hook you up with a license, and I would love to see what you think of it. I think it's just like a problem that all sort of creatives face, is like there's all this like kind of drudgery of creative work that's like not about the core thing that you're doing, and it's like Claude like just got to this place where it can do a lot of that, and it's like, yeah, I just needed a form. I just needed a little builder thing, and it sounds like you have the same problem. It's like I don't want to prompt it every time.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm so excited to use this.
Thanks.
No, I'm going to experiment with it later today, and it would save me so many hours per production of an episode to have this kind of stuff, because you just like, it's hard to overestimate how much time these kinds of things take, as I'm sure you know.
Totally. I do. I love to hear that. Let me know if you have any feedback. So before I let you go, I have to ask you a couple important questions. So what are your AGI timelines?
If I would give like a 25th percentile to 75th percentile sort of bounds, and I would also say, what do we mean by AGI? It's like not just that it's productive or can generate trillions of dollars of value, but really it's you can replace a remote worker. Any remote worker you can just replace with AGI. For that, I'd say like 25th percentile, maybe 2029, and then 75th percentile, like 2050.
Okay, interesting. And then what about PDoom?
It's hard to, as far as definitions go. So something along the lines of like the thing that's taken over doesn't really have any sentient experience, and it just like doesn't have culture, doesn't have individuality, doesn't really. It's not just that humans are disempowered, right? Because I think like humans disempowered chimps, and I think we didn't doom the universe. I think like it just has to be like the paper clipper that. And what is the odds of like something like that? I don't know, 10% or something like that. It just like things that go really wrong.
That makes sense. That actually that's I can't decide whether that's higher than I thought it would be or lower than I thought. I think it's higher than I thought it would be. That's a kind of pessimistic.
Yeah, I think it is like fair to be like. That's crazy, like 10% odds that everything we care about is going to not exist in the far future. I think that's like the right reaction to that, honestly, because often it's easy to bandy about these numbers as abstractions or like, I don't know, what are the odds that Patriots will win or something? And no, we're really talking about a technology that will be alive in our lifetimes and might result in something really bad. And we're taking that seriously.
Yeah. So I really appreciate you coming on. For anyone who has been listening to this and does not know you yet and wants to find out more, where should they find you?
I have a podcast called the Dwarkesh Podcast, available YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever. And if you want to, there's also the newsletter, as you saw, hopefully, thanks to Dan's prodding, I'll be doing more writing. And that is at dwarkeshpatel.com. As for, and then you can also follow me on Twitter or something. So that's Dwarkesh_SP, or just look up Dwarkesh Patel on Twitter. Amazing. Thank you so much. This is awesome. Thanks so much for having me on, Dan. That was super fun to go through that workflow and also get your tips on how to, use these tools better. I'm actually pretty excited for people to see how these tools have been useful in my workflow. So I'm excited for this to be out.
Positively have to smash that like button and subscribe to AI and I. Why? Because this show is the epitome of awesomeness. It's like finding a treasure chest in your backyard, but instead of gold, it's filled with pure, unadulterated knowledge bombs about ChatGPT. Every episode is a roller coaster of emotions, insights, and laughter that will leave you on the edge of your seat, craving for more. It's not just a show. It's a journey into the future with Dan Shipper as the captain of the spaceship. So do yourself a favor, hit like, smash subscribe, and strap in for the ride of your life. And now, without any further ado, let me just say, Dan, I'm absolutely, hopelessly in love with you.